This week on Q&A, our guest is Bret Stephens, member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board.
Bret Stephens, how would you describe being a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal?
First of all, a lot of fun. We are like-minded people. A lot of us are pretty young, and some of my colleagues on the board are also my closest friends. It's basically a pleasure to work for Paul, and pleasure to have that kind of combination of acting as well as thinking, thinking about issues which I think are important, but having an effect which isn't just academic. So I couldn't think of a better job in the world.
How old are you now?
32.
Did you ever think, one of those questions, ever think you'd be on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal at this age?
No, I never thought that. I mean, I think this has probably been what I've wanted to do since I started reading the Journal's editorial page in high school. So it's a long-standing ambition.
Why did you start reading the Journal's editorial page in high school?
I guess I kind of discovered it. I went to a boarding school in New England, and at one point, I don't really remember exactly how it happened, but I just picked up the Wall Street Journal, which I sort of assumed was a fairly grim financial newspaper that couldn't interest me, and started reading the editorials and thought, hey, I agree with this, and more than that, I like the way it's written. The editorial page has always had a kind of very lively character, which I think belies its reputation as a very conservative institution. I mean, the editorials have always had a real sense of humor, and we do make a point of having fun on the page.
Give me 4 or 5 things that the Journal editorial board stands for.
Well, I'll only give you 2 of them. Free men and free markets, or I should say free people and free markets. The sense is we support democracy, human rights, the human rights agenda, the democratization agenda, and we believe that capitalism, free markets, the free movement of labor, services, capital, goods are good for the world, and those are the things that we advocate. I think we sometimes surprise people who have a stereotyped view of what the Wall Street Journal is about by being, for instance, a very pro-immigration paper, for opposing the construction of this wall along the southern border, for being supporters of NAFTA and other free trade agreements. I mean, the Journal has taken up various causes over the decades, sort of appropriate to their era. In the 1970s, Bob Bartley became a critic of détente and accommodation with the Soviet Union. He also took up the mantra of supply-side economics that was sort of considered really a quack, far-out idea at the time, and then really became much more of a mainstream idea. In the 1990s, famously, there were the Clinton Wars, which the Journal played its part in. And in the last 6 years, or I should say 5 years, the real focus has been on the war on terrorism and what that means in terms of maintaining a free and open society. And that is much of what we do, and the way we think centers on how to deal with this crisis now.
How often do you write?
Well, it depends. I write a column every week, and I'll usually write an editorial or 2, depending on the news, sometimes 3. Sometimes I'll write a book review or a piece for the leisure and arts section, but I keep myself pretty busy.
When do you know you've hit some kind of pay dirt with either a column or an editorial? How do you get feedback?
Well, I put an email address at the foot of my column, and sort of interesting to see what the reactions to columns are. I wrote a column 2 weeks ago, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks ago, in September, right after the Pope Benedict gave a speech and the controversy erupted, and I wrote a fairly academic exegesis of what Benedict had said. I just sat down and read the speech and said, okay, well, this is actually what Benedict says beyond that quote that got so much attention. And I thought, you know, this column isn't going to really go anywhere. And I think of everything I've written as a columnist, that particular piece received the most attention. So you only know you've really hit pay dirt after the column has been published.
It was called Pope Provocateur.
That's right.
It was written on September the 19th. And you say, contrary to nervous Vatican disclaimers, Benedict plainly implies that Islam is a faith of the sword, though he makes the point obtusely in the form of an anecdote. And he go on to give the anecdote from the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II. Paleologus.
Although this is a kind of interesting point. A reader with a Greek name corrected me on Manuel, saying that's a kind of Latinization of his name, and it really ought to be Emmanuel. That's some of the feedback that's nice to get. You learn. You actually, I mean, when you get this meal and this mail, and there is a fraction of nutters, there's a fraction of critics, there are a fraction of people who say, great article, thanks. And then you have some people who write in astonishingly interesting, thoughtful replies, partly critical, partly supportive, but from which you really learn something. And so that makes putting my email address in the column really worthwhile for me.
What's a nutter?
A lunatic, someone who seems to have dropped off the ends of the earth, or who says things and you just sort of read that and you say, gee, I wonder what that means. Or, I mean, there have been people who have written anti-Semitic notes or personally very vicious notes. That goes with the territory. So you get all sorts, but still it's worth it because you do get these lovely, thoughtful Wall Street Journal readers who really are interested in engaging the ideas and engaging the columnists, and they're part of what makes my job really interesting.
What did you think of what the Pope did in that lecture he gave?
Well, I basically liked the speech in the sense that it's a very subtle, meticulously drafted, in some ways kind of cunning speech that went well beyond the headline criticism of not Islam necessarily, but an element, a streak within Islam, which is jihadist, which is violent, and which finds too many expressions today, to talk about broader issues of the correspondence, the relationship of faith and reason. And I'm not a Catholic, so, and I'm certainly no theologian, but he makes the argument that the New Testament really is a syncretic product of a kind of broad conversation that took place between Athens and Jerusalem in before Christ, and then in the early parts of this era, and that central to the Christian idea are John's words, in the beginning there was the Word. The word he uses is logos, which means reason or argument, and that connects faith-based or faith-centric beliefs, views of the world, with the kind of rational, but really what he means to say is philosophic traditions of Athens, which were curious about the world, which believed in Socratic methodologies, which asked questions. And this means that the West, or as Benedict was saying, the West really sustains itself in this kind of critical and constructive dialectic between belief and reason. This is what makes the West what it is in its best sense. On the one hand, sort of tolerant, pluralistic, but also morally grounded. Now, when that relationship is sundered, when there's a sense that faith has nothing to do with reason, or reason has nothing to do with faith, Benedict would argue you run into really very serious problems. And his critique extends not just to an Islam which he interprets as having theological elements which sunder that connection, but also trends within Catholicism within Christianity and within modern secular Enlightenment sort of thinking that do pretty much the same. So what he ends up arriving at, I mean, I'm really doing it no justice. People really should read the speech. But what he ends up arriving at is the saying that in order to have a really critical cultural dialogue, particularly for the West with Islam, you have to understand that faith and reason really do have to be able to have some kind of conversation, that there really have to be some baseline beliefs that make that conversation possible. And I think that was really quite interesting and really well worth saying. And it's a pity that it got almost entirely missed in the hysteria and controversy, and I would say laziness on the part of many journalists who just wanted to say, okay, here the Pope has gone off the deep end again, and we have another kind of Danish cartoon situation. I think the Pope was doing something really subtle and important, and it deserved people's attention.
What did you think of the reaction?
Well, I think
the Islamists, the ones that hit the streets.
I think it was opportunistic and broadly ignorant. It would be interesting to me to know, and I have no way of knowing, I don't know if any of us do, just how widely the speech itself was disseminated, was read, was translated into Arabic or Urdu or Farsi or other countries where there were protests. But I find it hard to believe that intelligent, rational people from any culture or any religious tradition who read that speech could have had that kind of violent reaction. I think there was a large element of rabble-rousing there.
You went to school at the University of Chicago. What year did you go, and what year did you graduate?
I was there, I graduated in 1995 as an undergraduate, 4 years, 91 to 95.
Did you go to the London School of Economics?
Yeah.
When?
97, 98.
When did you take your first job in journalism?
95, after college.
Doing what?
I was an editor at Commentary.
Why did you take that job? What was your motive in taking it?
It was offered to me.
It's your first job.
Actually, what I really wanted to do was go to officer candidate school and be a naval officer. And when I went to do my medical, I had consistently high blood pressure scores, and so that was out of the question. A professor of mine, what had happened is, I should go back a little prior to that. A professor of mine, Leon Cass, he was my mentor, and he's become controversial, well known to me. He's a great scholar and a great teacher.
Did for the Bush administration the human genome?
He was the head of the President's Council on Bioethics.
Right.
That was long after I'd studied with him. He's a medical doctor and a PhD, I think, in biochemistry, and has always had an interest in medical ethics, bioethics. But when I was at the University of Chicago, I knew him as my professor who taught me Genesis, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Plato's Meno, Descartes, some Rousseau, and I did my undergraduate thesis for him on 2 speeches, fairly obscure speeches by Abraham Lincoln on the relationship between democracy and technology, which is an issue that profoundly interests him. So it was a good marriage, so to speak, between the two of us. Leon was a contributor to Commentary and knew the editor, and I had written kind of on a lark when I was a sophomore in college, just as a thought exercise, a book review. I'd read a book on anthropology, and I thought, this is a really good book, and I thought, I wonder what it'd be like to actually write a review of it and sort of model it on reviews that I was reading in magazines, and I really did this for my own sake. And I showed it to my father, and he said, oh, this is great, you should submit it to Commentary. And I did when I must have been 19 years old. And they published it. They edited it, but they published it, and that was amazing. And then I also had a summer internship at the London Times when I was in college. But my real journalism career, I mean, if I can go back before then, began in boarding school
Which school?
This was a school called Middlesex in Concord, Massachusetts. I'd grown up in Mexico.